Let me call to order this meeting of the Transportation Service Delivery Advisory Committee for the purpose of discussing our work and then holding a public hearing. I will go through the roll just to allow us to see precisely who is here. I'm John McGlennon. I chair the TSDAC and am chair of the James City County Board of Supervisors and represent the Virginia Association of Counties on TSDAC. I'll call on Vice Chair Cindy Mester.
Good morning, everyone. Cindy Mester, Deputy City Manager for the City of Falls Church and representing VML on TSDAC. Thank you and good morning, all.
And I see Kate Mattice has joined us by computer now. Kate, would you just,
good morning.
How are you?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
No. Okay. I'm actually on the phone as well as on the computer. So
you are breaking up now.
Representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Sam Sink.
Sam Sink, Director of Planning and Scheduling at GRTC in Richmond, representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Okay. Brian Booth.
Good morning, I'm Brian Booth. I'm the Director of Transit at Blacksburg Transit, and I'm representing CTAB.
Dr. Raymond Smoot.
Good morning. I'm here and representing CTB.
Okay. Jim Dyke. Jamie Jackson. And Jen DeBrule. Is Jen a member?
Jen is on.
And Jen, let me just extend congratulations, as I indicated to you in my email. The Oscar goes to you. You are no longer, however, acting in this capacity. So congratulations on your appointment as Director of the Department of Rail and Public Transit.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be sticking around for a little bit longer, and I'm here because I've got a great team to work with every day.
Great. Okay. So that's so we have our attendance. We have a number of staff members. Grant is going to take us through, I believe, some of the items we're looking at here. We have Dan on board, Neil and Andy. Not sure who else I can see here, but in any case, we're going to begin today with a recap of the proposed changes to the Merit Capital Assistance Policy. And so, Grant, I'll turn that over to you.
All right, thank you, and good morning. Mary Olivia, if you could jump to the next slide. Actually, this is just the agenda for today. As Mr. Chair just mentioned, we're going to start with a recap of the action that was taken at the last TSDAC meeting, specific to the Merit Capital Policy and the recommended changes to that policy, as well as the recommended changes to the Transit Strategic Plan guidelines. We'll then recap our discussion from last month regarding the Merit Operating Assistance Formula. Mr. Chair mentioned that today we do have a public hearing. This is a requirement for TSDAC to hold a public hearing. So we will have that formal public hearing towards the end, and then we'll wrap up by going over next steps and kind of what to expect next year. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So, for the Merit Capital Policy, in June, our last meeting, TSDAC voted unanimously to recommend a handful of changes to this policy. The details of these recommended changes can be found in the meeting materials from April, May, and June. But to quickly summarize them, they include incentives for transit agencies to apply for more discretionary federal funding. We had lengthy discussions about how the federal infrastructure package included this giant influx of funding for transit capital projects, and that in order to bring as much of that funding into Virginia, we needed to make it worthwhile for our transit agencies to apply for that funding. So specifically, TSDAC recommended to establish a state capital discretionary set-aside that will provide DRPT the flexibility to conditionally allocate funding as a state match to projects that are being applied for through these federal discretionary grant programs. TSDAC also recommended to reduce the local match requirement for projects that are successful in their discretionary grant applications. Currently, as you all know, we have a 4% local match requirement on all capital projects, but this recommended change will allow DRPT to reduce that percentage. The second recommended change to this policy would be to update the asset condition scoring methodology to allow replacement vehicles and other assets to accrue points as they approach the end of their useful life. This change will allow for just-in-time deliveries of such assets. The current policy states that assets start accruing points at 95% of their expected service life. So for large buses with 12-year lifespans, this typically means that that asset isn't officially replaced until it's 13 or 14 years old, because it takes some time for the agencies to order the vehicle and then also for the vehicles to be built. So this change will essentially enhance the state of good repair backlog for such assets. Another recommended change is to update the scoring methodology to include more project categories in the service impact scoring. The rationale behind this change is that more categories will allow for more differentiation in project scoring. The current categories, I'd say, are fine and appropriate, but they do result in some lumpiness in the scoring. So this change will allow a little bit more of a stratification of scores. The fourth line item here is to add an incentive scoring category that will award additional points to projects that meet state priorities. The categories for this new incentive scoring include zero emission technology, innovation, safety and customer facilities, and agency accountability. And then the final one here on this list is that TSDAC is recommending some modifications to the scoring for major expansion projects. The biggest change here is to remove the weighting framework that assigns different weights based on area type. As you might recall, the scoring factors used in SMART scale are weighted differently by region, and historically we've applied a similar framework in the major expansion scoring methodology. However, after doing some sensitivity testing and looking at historical allocations and applications, we came to the conclusion that the impacts of such weighting are negligible. So that's a very quick summary of our recommendations as it relates to the capital policy. I'll just pause for a second before I move on to recapping the transit strategic plan guidelines changes, if there are any final thoughts or comments.
Thank you, Grant. And let me mention that Jim Dyke has joined us now, has been with us for the last few minutes. Is Jamie Jackson on board? Yeah. Okay. Before we move on, anybody have any questions or comments on this slide?
Yeah. Grant, what are the metrics of accountability? You mentioned adding so yeah, how will that be measured or evaluated?
Right, so this new incentive scoring that we're adding, it has those 4 overarching categories, and you can get 5 points for each category for a maximum of 10 points. So specific to the agency accountability category, we identified 4 areas where agencies can accrue points. That is compliance with state asset management requirements. So every transit agency is required to update their assets in our asset management database called Transam. And they need to do that at a certain time during the year in order for us to actually do the scoring for merit. So that's one, is to just make sure that the assets are updated in Trans-Am. There's also one in agency accountability for compliance with state strategic planning requirements. So just making sure that transit strategic plans and transit development plans are up to date. We also have compliance with state capital planning requirements. Again, once a year, every agency must submit a 5-year capital budget to DRPT. And so this just makes sure that those 5-year capital budgets are submitted to DRPT in a timely fashion. And then probably the biggest one here is compliance with state performance reporting. So making sure that all agencies are submitting their performance reports to DRPT on a monthly basis on time. Every transit agency per month is required to submit ridership, hours, and miles to DRPT. And so this category kind of gets to that. And so the agency accountability criteria is a little bit different than the other three, because it's an all or nothing thing. So in order to get those 5 points for agency accountability, a transit agency must comply with the asset management, strategic planning, capital planning, and performance reporting requirements to get those 5 points.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? If not, let's move on. Then we also looked at the question of guidelines for transit strategic plans. Grant?
Yes. So next slide, please, Mary Olivia. So again, TSDAC voted last month unanimously to make 2 recommended tweaks to the transit strategic plan guidelines. The first being a modification to the annual update process, moving from a letter submission to a joint quarterly meeting. Our rationale here is that the dialogue between the transit agency and DRPT staff surrounding their planning process, performance, and agency priorities will be more valuable than a formal document. We do not intend to disregard those requirements that we had in an annual update letter. Essentially, we'll just be asking the same questions and likely more questions in a joint quarterly meeting format, and we'll make sure to document it so that it's written down. But we just thought it would be more valuable to have a conversation rather than require agencies to submit this formal letter to us every year. The second recommended change is to modify the 5-year review of transit strategic plans from a major update to a minor update. This recommended change will not preclude agencies from creating a new strategic plan after 5 years. They can certainly do so if they choose with this change, but it does allow the flexibility for agencies that have not experienced a ton of change in that 5-year period, and thus it doesn't make sense to create a whole new plan from scratch if there are not a whole lot of changes within that agency. So now it's every 10 years, agencies will have to kind of revisit their strategic plan as a whole and create a new one. At the 5-year mark, they can just do a minor update as opposed to a major overhaul. So those were really the 2 recommended changes for the strategic plan guidelines. But again, I'll pause if there are any final comments or thoughts.
Okay. Any questions, comments from TSDAC members? All right, we can move on then.
All right, next slide, please. So switching gears to the merit operating assistance formula, we spent a good bit of time in May and in June discussing the impacts of COVID on transit ridership and how ridership recovery looks quite different region by region and agency by agency. No action was taken at last month's meeting, although the group did seem to reach a general consensus that the current formula is not broken and that it is functioning as intended. We did spend some time last month looking at FY24 projected allocations, and those projected allocations, as you might recall, used a handful of assumptions because we currently do not have FY22 audited expenditures, which are a key metric within our formula. And so, so we did focus our time, though, discussing the impact, the projected impact to agencies with significant projected shortfalls compared to FY21 funding levels. So as you might recall, those agencies that we kind of zeroed in on were VRE, Loudoun County, GLTC in Lynchburg, as well as Radar in the Roanoke area. So we talked a whole lot about that last month. This last bullet point here, DRPT is, however, recommending no action on the CTB operating policy at this time. And I think Jen wanted to chime in for some additional thoughts surrounding this.
Yeah, I think we have spent a fair amount of time as a group talking about, you know, implications of going back to using the performance data in the formula. Everything that we have presented to TSDAC is based on a series of assumptions, as Grant said, and really we're not in a place right now to be able to make recommendations that are specific to fiscal 24 funding. We still have a performance data set that we've got to complete. We do not have, you know, updated revenue data. So it's more timely for us to have a conversation about, you know, some of the information that BTA has done some additional analysis looking at, you know, other alternatives or considerations that could be made. It's really more timely to have those conversations with the Commonwealth Transportation Board in the spring as part of our annual programming process. When we have the full data set, we know what our revenues are, and we're in a better position to make a recommendation. The work that's before us right now is, you know, completing a triennial review of the policy. And, you know, as we thought about that more, really making no changes to the policy is where we landed, I think, as a group with TSDAC, that the policy itself is working as it's intended, that we may have some situations we need to address in the spring. So what I would like to do is for us to move forward based on that recommendation in terms of completing this triennial review, closing that out, and taking the recommended changes for capital and strategic planning to the board in September, and then commit to come back to TSDAC in the spring when we have a complete data set and we have revenues available to help have a continued discussion about any unintended consequences of going back to the performance-based formula before we make that final recommendation to the board specific to 24. That's not something that's really within TSDAC's authority, but I know we've spent a lot of time talking about it. And so we're open to having that conversation and committing to having that conversation with TSDAC in the spring in advance of taking a recommendation to the board. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as well today.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Any other comments or questions?
Chair, I do, and my apologies, I couldn't see how to do the digital hand. So I appreciate the summary we've gotten to, and also add my congratulations to Jen for this promotion. And the comments that were just shared. I concur that it makes sense to wait for spring because we don't have actual numbers, so we're still theoretically projecting. And I appreciate it's also the commitment to bring it back to us, even though we're not normally in that detailed allocation phase. But if we're not going to take action now, I feel like we're sort of just deferring our 3-year review of that piece till the spring. And so I guess where I am, and just as an opening statement, I'm comfortable with that recommendation with the commitment to come back and revisit spring as a group when we have revenue and we have audited numbers.
And Mr. Sherrod, so, and just to echo Cindy's comments, I know there's been a lot of attempts at finding some solutions. I definitely appreciate the formula and the way it is working, and knowing when we're talking about actuals, which is what we're looking at in the spring, and actually giving a little bit more time to sort of think through this. I think is very, very helpful. I very much appreciate DRPT as well as I have to say our colleagues at VTA for trying to troubleshoot some items. I know that we want to talk about Virginia Railway Express, the Commonwealth's contributions on the capital side. So I do hope that there'll be some clarity when we meet again in the spring. Real numbers. And again, I know this is a formula. So again, I'm just echoing the Vice Chair's statement. I do support this at this time and look forward to having a conversation in the spring.
Okay. Any other comments? Hearing none, let's go ahead and move on then, Grant.
Right. So this is where we move into the formal public hearing, Mr. Chair.
All right. So do we have indications from individuals who wish to address the public hearing?
Mary Olivia, do you see any hands raised?
Yes, there is one hand raised. Okay, Charles, if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm Charlie Grimes with the Prince William Conservation Alliance in Northern Virginia. I want to highlight the need for us to have steady, reliable funding for the Virginia Railway Express. If we are funding the Virginia Railway Express in peaks and valleys, then we're going to sabotage our efforts to get developers to commit to transit-oriented development. We need to have a reliable level of service for our high-capacity transit system in order for us to create the land use pattern that will ultimately be necessary for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we continue a pattern or a formula of funding VRE that doesn't give us a reliable source of funding to provide reliable service, then we can't get what we say we want as part of our climate change agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. And certainly it is an issue that TSDAC has been focused on. It's a challenge because it's an effort to address an agency that doesn't look like a lot of the other agencies that we deal with, but certainly understand the concern.
Okay, the next hand raised is Joseph. So if you could unmute yourself.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Morning.
Morning. Chairman, members of the committee, good morning. My name is Joe Swartz, Director of Government Affairs, Virginia Railway Express. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment today. For the past 2 fiscal years, DRP recommended transit operating assistance allocations were based on FY19, so pre-pandemic data, rather than FY20 and 20 data. The need for this was clear. The COVID-19 pandemic had a dramatic uneven impact on transportation providers across Virginia. It was apparent that cutting agency pandemic impact data would be counterproductive to transportation's response to the global health crisis and lay undue stress on many of the local governments that fund transit, the transit providers. That remains the case. In FY22, we saw far greater COVID cases than in FY20 and 21, which is a decision to allocate FY24 operating FY22 data kind of perplexing. DRE believes using pre-pandemic data for the only logical way to allocate operating assistance. Given the significantly cases in FY20 impact that had on public transportation ridership, we don't see why the Commonwealth would choose to use data from that basically getting state operating assistance when it recognized data for just 2 years were tainted by the health emergency. I'd like to add that just last week, VRE a passenger rail authority with a check for $119 million and will be providing the rail authority $75 over the next decade as part of our investment in the Commonwealth's Transforming Virginia program. Our partnership with the Commonwealth to make this historic investment in rail infrastructure is key to unlocking the passenger and freight rail in Virginia. Along with our investment, we're DPRA as it actively pursues federal funding for the Long Bridge and other projects that are transforming rail in Virginia. We're concerned, however, what message it will send our partners at the federal level when they see the Commonwealth investing in the rail service that would be the predominant user of the new and extended rail. We think it's imperative the Commonwealth find a way to continue and ultimately increase its level of support for commuter rail operations. In closing, its clear performance methodology that properly captures both bus and commuter rail operational efficiency is not. VRE asks TSDAC to acknowledge this in its recommendation to the DRPT and the CTB, so we can begin the conversation of how to best fund commuter rail operations outside of the merit program. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. I don't know if it was true for other members, but it was breaking up in my computer. So if you could submit any written comments, that would be helpful so that we can get a full understanding of the issue you raised.
Will do. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay,
We have other
the next hand raised is Kelly. You could go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. My name is Kelly Rowan. I am working for the Office of Equitable Transit and Mobility here in the city of Richmond. And we're just, tracking the equity considerations that are being, proposed or to be embedded into the merit capital and operating assistance program. And I just wanted to say that, as an office in the city of Richmond, and then also just as a person that's a transit advocate, I would really like to state, my support of considering measures that take into account equity instead of just, the cost efficiency and transit ridership per the equity and modernization study on page 24. That's one of the recommendations that came out of that, was to continue considering that. So I just wanted to state, general support for that, that concept. And if we could continue as, reviews continue to happen of these processes, if we could continue to take that into account, that would be great. Our support for that recommendation is strong. So
great. Thank you very much for those comments.
Okay, the next is Penny. If you could go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good morning, members of the TSDAC committee and Mr. Chair. I don't want to repeat everything I repeated at the last meeting, but I do want to emphasize the fact that given the lag in the FY22 numbers, which will be used for 24 appropriations, we are still in Loudoun County. I'm sorry, should have introduced myself. I'm from Loudoun County. We're still going to have a negative impact in terms of revenue for operating assistance. Again, at a time when we are expanding service, not only to Metro Rail, we are also looking very strongly about how we are providing equitable service within Loudoun County, because that's been a big area of emphasis as we've gone through the last couple of years discussing equity, not only in transit, but in other areas of the county. So I understand the direction the committee is taking, and I appreciate all of your work. It's just that, unfortunately, the way this process is working, it's going to have a negative impact on Loudoun County at a time when we are walking or, moving into the Metro Rail system, which is, of course, going to cost us more money, as well as just having the money we need to operate our operations here in Loudoun County. So thank you for your work. We'll hope for better outcomes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the next comment is from Danny. If you could go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the TSDAC committee. This is Danny Plugger. I'm speaking on behalf of Virginians for High-Speed Rail. I want to thank everyone for their hard work on TSDAC and the dedication to getting this right. As many of you know, a vital component of the Transforming Rail in Virginia program, which is improving Amtrak service for over 80% of Virginians, is the expansion and improvement of the Virginia Railway Express commuter rail service. VHSR has concerns about the perception of drastically reducing state support for VRE on one hand, while on the other hand, the Commonwealth is also pursuing aggressively Federal Transit Administration and multimodal grants to fund portions of the Long Bridge and the Transforming Rail in Virginia program. This action will certainly raise some eyebrows with the US DOT decision makers when they're deciding which projects to fund, especially when, according to the Washington Post, the challenges that facing coming out of the pandemic are also likewise impacting MARC service, the commuter rail service that serves Maryland and West Virginia. The VREs change the routes, their time slots, nor force the federal government and connected workforce to begin commuting again. So they should not be punished for things that are drastically outside of their control. Thank you again for your willingness to give this another look later this spring, and also for allowing me to speak to you today. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the comments, Mr. Plugger.
At this time, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay.
Chair, may I make a comment and ask a question?
Sure, sure.
One, I just want to acknowledge and thank those from the public that joined us for our public hearing. It's nice to have people at a public hearing when we hold the required public hearing, because I do think it speaks to the commitment we all have for good transit in the Commonwealth and the hard work of TSDAC since, 2013, I think. And then the question, as I was listening to the comments and I thought back to our decision to not take action on the operating and then have the spring meeting. Do we need to do anything formal in terms of a vote so it shows up in the minutes? I just realized I probably should have asked that before the public hearing. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Cindy. Grant, that's a question for you, I think, and for Director DeBrule.
I don't know, Jen, if you have any strong opinions there. I mean, I think nothing precludes you guys from taking official action, so it shows up in the minutes. I can also capture this, and we were going to capture this in the minutes either way. But if you guys want to take action, that's fine.
Yeah, right. I would concur with Grant. I think we've worked generally to consensus of the group, but if however you would like to handle that, it's fine.
Great. So let me ask the members then, would you like to take formal action today to endorse these recommendations?
Mr. Chair, if I may, I believe it would be helpful for anything that comes to CTB to have a vote by the committee. Mm-hmm. Any recommendations that come to CTB, I think would be good to have on record.
All right.
Yeah, this is Jim.
Thank you.
I concur with that.
Great. Okay. Well, it sounds to me as if there's enough interest in taking formal action. Does anybody want to make a motion?
Chair, I'm willing to give it a step, and I concur with doing a formal motion because we did on the other items. So I would move that TSDAC take no changes to the operating formula as currently in place after deliberate review at this time, with the commitment to reconvene in the spring to review or firm numbers in terms of audited numbers and state revenue.
Okay.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, can I ask, I don't know, can I ask for a show of hands, or maybe I'll just ask if there is anyone who, just ask a sign of aye for all those in favor of the motion.
Aye.
Aye.
Those who are opposed signify by saying no. Any abstentions, please indicate now. Okay, so the TSDAC has unanimously adopted that resolution. Okay.
Mr. Chair, one final thing. I did receive a message from Jamie Jackson, and she is on the line.
Oh, great. Okay, Jamie, thank you for letting us know that. Okay. All right. So now we are to next steps.
Yes. Next slide, please, Mary Olivia. So in terms of next steps and specifically regarding the changes to CTV policy, our intention is to post both the changes to the capital policy and the changes to the transit strategic plan guidelines next week for public comment. And so as you might remember, we have a 45-day public comment period for both of those. At the September CTB meeting, which is held in Stanton, we will be presenting these changes to the CTB workshop. And then in October, the CTB meeting will be held in Virginia Beach in conjunction with the Governor's Transportation Conference. And we will be presenting to the action meeting, asking them to take formal action on those policies and guidelines. So that's kind of the schedule for both of those big policies. And then this last bullet point, we've, I think, already talked about, reconvening in early calendar year 2023, as we're kind of working through the FY24 allocations and formula. So I guess, unless you choose to actually want to pinpoint a month, we can always just circulate some potential dates, times as we get closer to the end of the calendar year to make sure that it's on everyone's calendars.
Okay, I think we can wait till we get a little bit more clarity on other items that might matter to us. We'll have the governor's budget submitted before the end of the year. We'll have some sense of where the economy's headed, I suppose, and we'll hopefully have a good sense of when we'll have the data that will be needed for us to do that reconsideration.
And Chair, could I just ask, so we have sort of the window, because I agree with all of the points you just made, is we don't want to meet before that. What's the allocation date? Can you remind me when DRPT would make their allocation that then go to the CTB? Since we want to have that end date, we would meet before that month, which is, and I need a refresher.
Yeah, so we take the draft 6-year program to the board in April. So I would anticipate that we would meet sometime in March.
Thank you. That's helpful, just sort of the planning, and I do believe we could come back and firm that date up. But at least everybody who's listening and those who participate in the public hearing would know our window. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I had a question. Could the office send us the dates and location for the September meeting where these recommendations are being presented to CTB, just in case some of us want to sit in on and attend that?
Sure, we can send it out to you. The CTB meeting will be held September 20th and 21st, and that meeting will be in Stanton.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'll include more detailed information in the meeting minutes.
Great.
Okay.
Presumably there will be an agenda at some point that indicates when this topic will be up.
So when the board travels, typically we have workshop on the Tuesday morning between 8:30 and noon. I can tell you I only know what DRPT has for the workshop right now. I don't know what VDOT might have, but I do expect it to be a heavy workshop month. So some of the workshop items may carry over to Wednesday morning as well. So I will have more information on that after the 1st of September once we brief the secretary on the board schedule or the board package for the month and have an opportunity to see how that agenda lines out.
Thank you very much. Okay. Anything else you need from us, Grant?
No, sir. We're done.
Anything else that a member would like to bring forward? If not, we've been very efficient this morning. We are just at about 10:45. So if there is no further business, I will adjourn this meeting of TSDAC.
Thank you.
Hope you all have a good remainder of the summer. Stay
Okay.
cool.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you, John.
Well, stay safe.